The Bodleian Library, Oxford. Among its thousands of manuscripts, a 15th century copy of the Notitia Dignitatum resides, the official register of offices for the late Roman Empire. For centuries, historians pored over its pages, oblivious to the faint marginalia, dismissed as the meaningless scribbles of a weary copyist. Yet, in the early 21st century, beneath the probing gaze of a multispectral scanner, the faded inks began to whisper their secrets. Beneath the seemingly random scrawls, numbers emerged, a shadow ledger kept discreetly beside the official legionary rosters. The revelations were staggering. Up to 40% of the army, fully funded on paper, existed only as phantom legions. This wasn't decline, it was sabotage. In that moment, the cold case of the crime that brought down an empire was reopened. The dawn of the 5th century. On maps, the Roman Empire still appeared indomitable. From the misty shores of Britannia to the scorching sands of Egypt, paved roads stretched endlessly. The Mediterranean remained Mare Nostrum, our sea, a vital artery where ships laden with African grain sailed without interruption. Officially, nothing portended catastrophe. The system, refined over centuries, hummed along. Laws were enforced, taxes collected, and governors ruled the provinces in the emperor's name. In Rome itself, life unfolded in its customary rhythm. The aristocracy, within their opulent villas perched on the hills, debated Greek philosophers and lamented the decline of public morals. The plebs, packed into their overcrowded insulae, demanded their customary bread and circuses. The forum buzzed with the clamor of merchants, while senators in their pristine white togas convened in the curia. It seemed as if this immutable order had always been and always would be. The eternal city stood inviolable, but this was merely a facade. Look closer, and fissures appeared on the marble statues of gods and emperors. The magnificent aqueducts, once symbols of Roman might, now leaked in places, with no one rushing to repair them. In the ports, disruptions to food supplies grew more frequent, stirring a muted grumble throughout the capital. The state poured colossal sums into its army, yet border security grew increasingly tenuous. On the Rhenish limes, in a cold barracks, a legionary named Gaius finished cleaning his worn gladius. He'd heard veterans' tales of a time when the legions were a force capable of crushing any foe. Now, his cohort was barely two-thirds staffed, their pay delayed for months, and the recruits, mostly Germans, hired to defend against their own kinsmen. He didn't know that back in Rome, the treasury reports listed his unit as fully manned and equipped. This illusion of strength was the empire's most perilous adversary. The barbarian tribes, massing at the borders, were not the cause of the illness, but merely its symptom. They saw what Rome refused to acknowledge. The Colossus stood, but its feet were made of clay. The empire had yet to realize that its death warrant had already been signed. Not with a barbarian sword, but with a treasury clerk's pen in the quiet of an office. August 24th, 410 CE. For 3 days, Rome lived in an unnerving silence, broken only by the watchman's cries from the walls. Outside the Salarian gate stood Alaric's Visigothic army. The city's inhabitants refused to believe what was unfolding before their eyes. For 800 years, no enemy had set foot on the sacred streets of the Eternal City. The very thought seemed sacrilege, an absurd fabrication. The empire had negotiated, paid ransoms, and schemed, but its heart had always remained untouched. At the stroke of midnight, a creaking sound echoed. The heavy hinges of the Salarian gate slowly yielded. Historians still debate who opened them, slaves desperate for freedom or bribed guards. This was no siege. There was no thunder of battering rams, no desperate defense. Instead, it was a quiet, almost mundane betrayal that invited chaos within. The piercing wail of Gothic horns rent the night's silence. Panic instantly enveloped the city. It wasn't the fear of battle, but the terror of incomprehension. Citizens, roused by shouts and the glare of fires, spilled into the streets, seeking protection. But there was none. The urban cohort, once the formidable Praetorian Guard, had long since devolved into a ceremonial unit. Where were the legions whose eagles once struck fear across the globe? Where were the veterans, hardened by hundreds of battles? The answer was simple and horrifying. They weren't there. At least, not here, and not in the numbers required. Emperor Honorius was sequestered in impregnable Ravenna. Generals plotted intrigues hundreds of miles from the capital, dividing power and financial spoils. On paper, in the registers of the Notitia Dignitatum, the empire still boasted dozens of legions. In reality, there was no one to defend the capital. For 3 days, the Goths plundered the city. They weren't aiming to destroy it, they came for loot. Gold and silver were carried out of palaces, precious scrolls from libraries, statues from the Forum. Fires, flaring up here and there, were more a consequence of chaos than deliberate destruction. But it wasn't just buildings that burned. The very idea of the Eternal City was consumed by the flames. When Alaric's army departed, leaving behind a ransacked, humiliated capital, the world had changed forever. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a tectonic shift in consciousness. For the first time in nearly a millennium, the symbol of global order lay defenseless. And the main question contemporaries asked themselves in Constantinople, in Antioch, in Gaul, wasn't, why did the barbarians attack? It was far deeper. How did the most powerful state in history allow this to happen? The investigation had begun. News of Rome's fall spread slowly across the empire, yet its impact was akin to a lightning strike. Jerome of Stridon, the scholar-monk, writing from Bethlehem, penned, "The brightest light of all the world has been extinguished." My voice sticks in my throat, and while I dictate, sobs choke me. The city that had taken the whole universe captive is itself captured. This was more than grief. It was a metaphysical horror. If Rome had fallen, then the very foundations of the cosmos had crumbled. In Italy itself, in Ravenna, the imperial court's reaction was different. Historians recount an anecdote that, better than any analysis, reveals the chasm between the elite and reality. When Emperor Honorius was informed, "Rome has perished," he cried out in horror, believing the news referred to his beloved pet rooster, also named Rome. Upon learning it was merely the city that had fallen, he responded with relief, "And here I thought my bird was in trouble." This grotesque episode stands as a damning indictment of a system that had lost all connection with reality. The empire's intellectual elite immediately began searching for culprits, but they looked in the wrong direction. Pagans asserted that the city had fallen because Romans had betrayed their old gods for Christianity. In response, Augustine of Hippo penned his monumental work, The City of God, arguing that the heavenly kingdom does not depend on the fate of earthly empires. Decades were spent in theological disputes, in the search for spiritual causes of the catastrophe. No one bothered to conduct an audit of military expenditures. No one questioned why the legions, for which colossal taxes were allocated, failed to protect the capital. Instead, the shadow bureaucracy found a perfect alibi for further actions. Under the pretext of the barbarian threat, new emergency taxes were levied. Army recruitment drives were announced. On paper, new units were created, and funding was immediately opened for them. The catastrophe of 410 CE was not a lesson for them, but a business model. They understood that constant managed chaos on the borders was the best way to distract attention from embezzlement at the core. While everyone debated gods and barbarians, they, in the quiet of their offices, rewrote registers, redirecting financial flows. This utter failure to comprehend the true causes of the crisis allowed the cancerous tumor of corruption to grow to unprecedented proportions, hidden in the shadow of fear of an external enemy. The weapon that crushed Rome was neither the Germanic sword nor the Hunnic bow. It was quiet, invisible, and far more lethal. It was the very Roman administrative machine warped into an instrument of total embezzlement. The key element of this mechanism was a phenomenon modern investigators would call the Phantom Legion, and it operated with flawless, deadly logic. The reconstruction of this scheme goes like this. Step 1. A general on the frontier, say in Gaul, sends a report to Ravenna or Rome. The enemy is strong, he claims, and recent battles have led to heavy losses. To hold the front, an existing cohort urgently needs reinforcement, or a new one, perhaps 500 men strong, must be formed. The report is bolstered by fabricated battle accounts and casualty lists. Step 2. The report lands on the desk of a military official, a willing participant in the system. He approves the request. Funds are allocated from the imperial treasury. Not just the pay and stipends for 500 soldiers, but also money for their complete outfitting, armor, helmets, swords, shields. Funds are also allocated for provisions, fodder for horses, and camp maintenance. Gold is dispatched to the province. Step 3, the decisive one. The general receives the funds. Instead of 500 soldiers, he hires 150, the cheapest, most desperate barbarian mercenaries willing to serve for food and a tiny fraction of the official pay. The remaining 350 men exist only on the rolls. The gold allocated for their salaries, weapons, and sustenance lines the pockets of the general and his patrons in the capital. There was no antidote for this. The system was closed and self-protecting. Any inspector sent to verify matters either received a bribe or faced perfectly forged documents. All military failures were conveniently blamed on superior enemy forces. What's more, war itself was profitable. It allowed for endless demands for new funds and the write-off of non-existent soldiers as fallen in battle. Thus, the empire paid for ghosts. According to the data encrypted in the Notitia Dignitatum by the mid-5th century, up to 40% of the Western Roman Empire's army was a fiction. This was not merely corruption. It was a deliberate program to bleed the state from within, transforming the army, once Rome's greatest instrument, into its gravedigger. The true enemy lurked not in the forests of Germany, but in the legion's headquarters. 457 CE. A man who should not have been there ascended to the throne of the Western Roman Empire, Flavius Julius Valerius Majorian. He was no puppet. He was a soldier, a general, and most dangerously for the system, an investigator on the throne. He saw the disease and resolved to cure it. His laws against corruption and the plundering of Rome were a direct challenge to the shadow bureaucracy. But his main blow was aimed at the very heart of their power, Africa, seized by the Vandals and transformed into their independent stronghold and source of piratical threat. For 3 years, Majorian prepared his campaign. This was not just a military operation, it was the empire's last chance for revival. Troops converged from all corners of Gaul, Italy, and Illyricum. Remnants of old legions, detachments of barbarian foederati. In the Spanish harbor of Portus Ilicitanus, modern-day Alicante, an armada of more than 300 ships was assembled. This was the largest fleet the Western Empire had gathered in 100 years. The stakes were at their absolute highest. Success would mean the return of Rome's primary breadbasket, the restoration of control over the Mediterranean, and a devastating blow to the corrupt elite who profited from chaos. May of 460 CE. Everything was ready. The emperor personally arrived in Spain to lead the expedition. He stood on the shore, gazing at the forest of masts. It was a tangible symbol of rekindled might, the fruit of his colossal efforts. It seemed history was turning back. Rome was ready to conquer again. And at that very moment, the system struck back. One night, a Vandal fleet, led by King Gaiseric, launched a surprise attack on the harbor. But this was no fair naval battle. According to historical sources, the Vandals knew precisely where and when to strike. They acted with the aid of traitors. The Roman fleet was burned at its moorings, never even having a chance to put to sea. The grand plan, the empire's last hope, turned to smoke and ashes in a matter of hours. For Majorian, this was the end. His army was intact, but without a fleet, it was useless. He was forced to conclude a humiliating peace with the Vandals. It seemed the investigation had hit a dead end. The last reformer had suffered a crushing defeat. The shadow bureaucracy could celebrate their victory. Their version of events, about the invincibility of the barbarians and the weakness of the emperor, appeared irrefutable. The case was closed. After the catastrophe in Spain, Majorian was doomed. On his return to Italy, he was apprehended and 5 days later executed on the orders of Ricimer, the barbarian general, the kingmaker, who was the chief pillar of the shadow bureaucracy. The system had eliminated the investigator who had come too close to the truth. By killing the emperor, they believed they had committed the perfect crime. They were convinced they had buried the secret along with him, and in this lay their fatal error. Confident in their impunity, they failed to destroy the primary evidence, the very accounting system itself. They meticulously maintained and refined their shadow accounting. The official entries of the Notitia Dignitatum presented an impeccable facade, but in the margins of copies and in secret ledgers for internal use, they painstakingly recorded the true state of affairs. These annotations, crafted with an intricate system of abbreviations and ciphers, seemed utterly impenetrable to them. They were convinced that no one, ever, would decipher the meaning of these cryptic scrawls. They gravely underestimated a future investigator, separated from them by a span of 1,500 years. Let us fast forward to the 21st century. Dr. Eleanor Vance and her team direct the beams of a multispectral scanner onto the yellowed pages of an Oxford manuscript. The stroke of genius here wasn't a military maneuver, but the deployment of technology capable of revealing the unseen. Slowly, pixel by painstaking pixel, a computer meticulously analyzes the faded inks, distinguishing later layers from the original markings. And then, an astonishing revelation emerges. The seemingly meaningless scrawls suddenly gain structure. These aren't random annotations, they are numbers. And beside them, abbreviated designations of legions and cohorts. Legio V Macedonica, Cohors I Britannica. When Vance's team cross-referenced these numbers with the official figures in the main text, the scope of the crime became blindingly clear. Next to a legion officially recorded as 6,000 strong, an annotation read 2,100. Opposite an auxiliary cavalry unit of 500 riders, the mark indicated 130. In that instant, all the disparate pieces of evidence coalesced into a unified, damning narrative. The fall of Rome in 410 CE. The city wasn't deserted because all legions were stationed at the borders, but because they simply didn't exist in their reported numbers. The disastrous failure of Majorian's African expedition. It now became glaringly obvious that it had been sabotaged from within by those unwilling to relinquish their lucrative trade in paper soldiers and perpetual warfare. Everything clicked into place. The Notitia Dignitatum, once merely an administrative register, had transformed into the ledger of history's longest and most devastating crime. The empire wasn't slain by the sword, but by the pen. And now, the investigation had its smoking gun. With Majorian's assassination in 461 CE, the investigation was abruptly halted. The system had won. Now unchecked, the embezzlement spiraled into a systemic pattern. Ricimer, the de facto ruler of Italy, installed one puppet emperor after another, each merely signing the decrees he demanded. Financial flows, originally earmarked for maintaining control of Gaul, Spain, and Illyricum, were diverted to support lavish court expenses and the personal enrichment of the elite. Drawing upon the data from this shadow accounting, we can reconstruct how this scheme operated in practice. A loyal governor in Gaul, desperately attempting to stem the Gothic tide, dispatches a request for legionary reinforcements. His plea is denied, citing a lack of funds. Simultaneously, a phantom unit in Italy, existing solely on paper, receives full funding. The money is then siphoned off and distributed between Ricimer and his inner circle. Provinces, stripped bare of troops and resources, crumbled one by one. This was not a military defeat. This was a controlled demolition. By 475 CE, the Western Roman Empire had been reduced to a mere caricature of its former self. It controlled only Italy and a small fraction of the Alpine region. On the throne sat a boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a derisive symbol of utter powerlessness. The true power lay with the army, a conglomeration of barbarian mercenaries commanded by their own chieftains. And this army, witnessing the elite pilfering the last remnants of the treasury, decided it was time to demand its share. Odoacer, leader of the Germanic mercenaries, demanded on behalf of the entire army that the emperor's father, Orestes, provide his soldiers with land in Italy for settlement. This was a standard ultimatum, but Orestes refused. He couldn't possibly agree because there was nothing left to give. The treasury was utterly depleted. The lands belonged to the senators, who were, in fact, the primary beneficiaries of the corrupt system. On the 4th of September, 476 CE, it all came to an end. There was no palace siege, no bloody battle for Rome. Odoacer simply marched into Ravenna, arrested Orestes, and executed him. The young Romulus Augustulus he deposed, but showing clemency, did not kill, instead exiling him to an estate with a lifelong pension. This was not a grand clash of civilization versus barbarism. This was a pink slip. Odoacer then performed a final symbolic act. He gathered the emblems of Western imperial power, the diadem, the purple mantle, the scepter, and sent them to Constantinople, to the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. The message was clear and unambiguous. The West no longer needed its own emperor. The position was abolished as redundant. The crime was complete. The Western Roman Empire, hollowed out from within, ceased to exist. It wasn't the barbarian army that triumphed. It was the shadow bureaucracy. But their victory wasn't merely to plunder the empire and vanish. Their true triumph was to outlive it. The corrupt senators who had looted the treasury didn't become victims of chaos. They used their ill-gotten wealth to entrench themselves in their estates, transforming them into impregnable strongholds. The barbarian generals who sabotaged the army didn't disappear into history. They became kings. They didn't destroy the system, they privatized it. Each carved out a piece of the empire, swapped the sign from Roman governor to King of the Goths or Duke of the Burgundians, and continued to rule. The losers were everyone else. Millions of ordinary citizens of the empire for whom Rome was not an abstract idea, but a lived reality. It was the reality of safe roads where a merchant could travel. The reality of aqueducts supplying cities with clean water. The reality of a unified law that, however imperfectly, protected a citizen from arbitrary power. All of it vanished. Roads became deadly. Cities shrank behind fortified walls. Trade ground to a halt. The price of this elite's victory was the onset of an era later dubbed the Dark Ages. This wasn't merely a change of power, it was a civilizational collapse. The loss of technologies, the forgetting of engineering knowledge, a sharp decline in literacy. The unified world, bound by a common language, culture, and law, fractured into hundreds of isolated, warring mini-states where the only law was brute force. The concept of the common good, res publica, died, yielding its place to the right of private property and personal fealty to a feudal lord. The tragic irony is that the empire's murderers became its heirs. They were not punished. On the contrary, it was they and their descendants who formed the new aristocracy of medieval Europe. They built their castles on the ruins of Roman villas and their power on the fragments of Roman law. The triumph of this system wasn't in a single moment, not in the deposition of the last emperor. It was in their success at transforming the greatest empire in history into their personal asset, paying for it with the future of an entire continent. And here we are again in Oxford, in the hushed tranquility of the Bodleian Library. The Notitia Dignitatum manuscript lies under glass. Now, it is no longer just a dry administrative list. It is the crucial piece of evidence. The encrypted notes in its margins are not scrawls, but a confession, penned by the very hand of the system itself. A document created to record imperial might became the ledger of its deliberate dismantling. We look upon it and understand that the story of Rome's fall is not a tragedy of decline. It is the case file of history's largest embezzlement. The legacy of this crime proved more enduring than the empire itself. It left a scar on the body of Europe, plunging it into centuries of fragmentation and decline. But most importantly, it left us an eternal lesson about the nature of complex systems. The Roman Empire was not destroyed by an external force. It was brought down by an internal vulnerability, corruption that became more vital than survival, and personal gain that was prioritized above the common good. The barbarians, whom we typically cast as the culprits, were merely history's cleanup crew. They didn't murder a living organism. They simply dismembered a corpse that had long gone cold from within. The enemy wasn't outside, at the city walls. He sat in the Senate, in the military headquarters, in the treasurer's offices, and his weapon was not a sword, but a pen and a ledger. This process of self-destruction is far from unique. It echoes throughout history with alarming regularity. And the central question this case leaves us with resonates powerfully today. What poses a greater danger to any civilization? The overt enemy, standing at the gates with a drawn sword, or the inconspicuous official who, from within those very gates, with a stroke of a pen, systematically erases its defenders from the rolls?